I'd like to begin by thanking Kahua for sponsoring today's webinar. Kahua is the world's only full-featured project management information system that is FedRAMP authorized. It is also the only PMIS built on a low-code platform, enabling an entire ecosystem to create crowdsourced solutions. So with that, I'd like to first introduce our guests and have them tell us a bit more about themselves and some of the work that they do in the government space. We have Amy Gludzinski, who's a customer relationship executive for Kahua, and Steve Sproul, who's the director of solutions delivery at OnIndus. Starting with you, Amy, tell us a bit more.
Sure, thanks, Justin. So as you mentioned, Kahua is the first and only low-code platform specifically built for construction project management. We're also the only fully featured PMIS with FedRAMP authorization. And personally, within different roles I've had at both Kahua as well as at previous organizations, I've had the opportunity to work with customers at all levels of the ecosystem, including government and other owners, general contractors, program managers, and designers. This has allowed me to obtain a great understanding of the requirements of all the participants and their needs for making processes more efficient through the use of technology.
Terrific. Steve.
Yeah, hey there, Justin. Thank you very much. Thank you, Amy. So my name's Steve Sproul, and I'm actually an industrial engineer by degree and background, and I've been working in and around the application development space and reporting for at least 20 years. Now, I'm actually a founding partner with OnIndus, and we're a construction technology company that helps owners on this digital journey, working with systems like Kahua and others. And so, as such, we end up working with a lot of municipal government owners. And what ends up happening is that, as the topic for today is, funding being one of the key areas that people are really interested in, and so that's kind of one of the areas that we focus on.
Terrific. Well, welcome to you both. We look forward to the conversation. Before we get into the discussion with our panelists, we do have a couple poll questions I'd like to put to all of you just to get a sense of where you, the audience, are coming from. So we have two of them. Go ahead and respond, if you will. First question is, which of the following describes your organization? Which of the following describes your organization? Architect, engineer, general contractor, program manager, owner, subcontractor, or other? As Steve alluded to a second ago, lots of interest in this topic from lots of different types of organizations and lots of different types of folks. So we're very curious to hear where all of you are coming from. So we see quite a few other, it should be interesting. Some on the program manager side, a few owners, a few architect engineers, and quite a few in the others. Maybe a little bit later on in the audience Q&A, we can hear a little bit more and get a sense of where everyone's coming from on the other category. One more poll question before we jump in, just again to give us a sense of where all of you are coming from. What is your role specifically within your organization? So the previous question was about the organization itself. Tell us a little bit about your role within the organization. Construction, design, executive, facilities and operations, finance, information technology, or something else. So a question here about a whole range of potential roles for you, the audience, within your organizations. So we see quite a few on the executive side, a few in finance, lots of IT folks, and a few other. So thank you all very much for replies. Very helpful to give us a sense of where all of you are coming from. Good mix of finance, IT, executive, and a few others. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our jump into the questions for you, our panelists. So of course, we're here today talking, as Steve mentioned a second ago, about multiple sources of funding, and multiple sources of funding specifically within the context of capital projects, capital construction projects. Given that we've got folks coming from lots of different backgrounds, let's make sure that we understand where we're coming from when we talk about some of these concepts. I'm wondering if Amy, you might be able to. I'm sorry, Steve. Let's start with Steve. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about a project that you've worked on that had multiple sources of funding and some of the potential challenges with multiple sources of funding.
Yeah, Justin, the example that I always go to when I'm discussing funding is the client, New York City Housing Authority, that we work with in New York City. And I don't think you could have a more complicated funding blend than you do at the Housing Authority. And so what's happening in that situation is you have federal funding, you have state funding, you have city funding, you have operational funding, and all of these different funding types are subject to different audit requirements, very stringent on the different types of work that can be used for the funding, as well as the fact that in some instances you're looking to recoup, you're paying money out and then you're coming back and you're actually recouping that funding in the situation with the state in New York. So this is an account where it's really, really critical that you have a good handle on funding and you make sure that you're as integrated as much as possible with your funding sources so that you can even begin to report on it and manage it. And as everyone is also aware, New York got hit pretty hard by COVID, and during COVID, there was a situation where the city funding ended up effectively being shut down at some point because of the shortfall with the budget that they had. And so there was a time period when we were working with New York City and we were having to actually figure out how to move the funding around and what funding would it be able to pay for what, and switching funding sources out. So that's without a doubt that's the number one example of the most complicated and definitely, I guess, robust is one way to say the accounts that we work with that has funding.
Of course. Amy, tell us a little bit about your experience with that as well. Why is it important to track different sources of funding, and to whom does that matter? Who cares about that information?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really important to just basically have controls and transparency in place from the initiation of a program or release of funds from its source, no matter what source that is. Many organizations are subjected to periodic audits to receive funding, and without transparency and easy access to the data for reporting on how these funds are being spent, it's really very difficult for those that are put in charge, like the finance folks mostly, that are put in charge with providing the information for these audits. And this is so important because these organizations can lose this funding, or even worse, have to pay back funds for existing work in place if they're not able to provide satisfactory data reporting for these audits. So this makes the ability to easily track the fund sources and how they're being used imperative, not only to the finance folks that are the ones that are doing the tracking themselves most of the time, but really to all parties managing and performing the work, as well as any beneficiaries of the final project outcome.
Makes good sense. So given how important it is, you would think that we would have figured out a way to do it quickly and easily, but it turns out that that's not exactly the case. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about why this has been difficult to do, to track these resources, particularly over time, historically?
Yeah.
And from your vantage and from the construction owner and construction manager perspective, how have you kind of dealt with that in the past? What are some of the tools that you've used that might be relevant to this conversation?
So when we talk about funding and funding's not new. It's been one of the main ways that construction CIP projects have actually been funded always. And what happens though is that you're dealing with, maybe you've got an ERP system where you're keeping track of it from the finance, pure finance. Like you got a bucket of money, and that money is like well-defined in the finance system. But when it comes down and you have to, as Amy alluded to, it's got to be auditable on what did you actually spend this on. And as anybody that's ever worked in the construction industry is well aware, they may be tracking your entire project on like one line item of a budget in the ERP system with maybe 2 funding sources that go against that one contract that's in the ERP. And so you're dealing with a system that's not really set up to bring it down to a detail level. And that's always been a problem, is that how do you apply funding in different blends at a level, at an SOV line level? You've got individual lines of a contract with thousands of contract lines in them, and you may have only 5 lines that this funding source can go across. And so, it's not an easy ask to start with. When people were looking to set up these PMIS systems a long time ago, they were happy that they were getting their budgets in. They were happy that they're getting their commitments in, and that their vendors could invoice. That was like great. And then funding is something that was a little bit late to the game. They got all these other facets of the PMIS stood up, and then funding was one of the last ones. And so what ended up happening is you had tremendously complicated Excel spreadsheets that were going to be put in place. And anytime you've got a gap in the way that you manage your project, typically a spreadsheet will magically appear. And so that's how a lot of people were running their funding. And it's not uncommon to see people still doing it that way. Now, there's been great advances in the PMIS, and now you've got the ability to do that color of money across all your contracts and be able to report across them. But that's still an evolutionary process. And so some of the systems that we work with, they don't necessarily do that very well. They do it, and it can be done, and reporting can be done. But that's where you've got newer systems and the newer generation of PMS that are getting even better at it. So I hope that answered your question, yes.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and maybe as a follow-up to that too, then, I mean, as you mentioned, OnIndus specializes in helping construction owners use technology to improve their outcomes.
Yeah.
A lot of what you're describing, it sounds like it's sort of part a technology challenge, but also, to a degree, kind of a leadership and culture challenge. And so when you think about making the kind of transitions that you were talking about, what sorts of, how are you helping owners and helping leaders in these organizations sort of come in and leverage these tools to maximum effect?
So I had a conversation today when I was dealing with one of our municipality organizations earlier, and it was not a funding conversation, but it was the same sort of question and same sort of answer. And it's that very, very frequently, and I'm sure a lot of you that are out there in the audience right now are hearing this, is that someone came in and maybe they failed an audit. I think Amy alluded to this as reasons why people have to get in there and they have to start managing. And what ends up happening is that there's this mad rush to digitize, put everything electronic. And what do? They immediately take their archaic paper-based system and they put it into an electronic system. And what we're finding is that when you approach problems like this, and you want to really make it as efficient as possible for an organization, it's really critical that the leadership looks at it as a revolutionary change to the way that they do business, as opposed to an evolutionary change. Very common business policy is simply because 3 vice presidents ago, somebody was like, well, I got burned and now we're going to do it this way. And then another vice president comes in behind that and says, well, now we got burned this other way, so we're going to do the first thing and we're going to do the second thing. And then you get a third vice president that comes in and says, well, I got burned again, and now we're going to do the first, the second, and the third. And the whole time, people are looking at it like you've created this incredibly complex maze that has to be navigated anytime that somebody wants to be able to go in and actually perform their business operation. And it's really critical when we start to do these types of engagements. One of the things that we really like to get people to understand is that, are you really doing it the right way? Like, what are you really trying to solve here? What are you really required to be able to answer to? And start with that. It's the Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. What are you trying to achieve? What do you have to be responsible for? What requirements do you have on a reporting standpoint? And then using that as your focal point and your anchor, then you build your business processes around that. And it's not always easy to do, and sometimes it takes some intestinal fortitude that a lot of people don't have. However, if you don't engage on that, it's very, very easy to get brought back into the same, well, we'll just do it the way we've been doing it, except now we're going to do it faster, or we're going to do it more inefficient because we're doing it digital.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Amy, I can imagine you have some things to add to what Steve just said, particularly from Kahua's perspective on how it is that you all go about maybe smoothing out some of the types of challenges that Steve just described.
Yeah, it's really, as Steve mentioned, it's so important to work on the process first before even broaching the subject of technology, right? I mean, it's as you don't want to just carry bad process into technology because it's never going to work out in the end. So, you really got to work out the requirements around that business process and then introduce that technology. And hopefully it's a technology that's flexible enough to handle it. And you can have confidence that the technology is going to work and not still keep that side Excel spreadsheet that everyone loves to keep, right? That always seems to happen. So but yeah, Justin, we at Kahua have built tools to help iron out and make the process less painful for all the parties involved. So Kahua is a project management solution with this layer of the sources of funds features on the top. So our features allow organizations to track, first of all, the appropriations into a fund source, so the money coming in, the allocation of that money in the fund sources to projects, including an approval workflow process for each individual project, if that's something that you need. You also have the ability to define rules for projects that are funded from multiple sources. As we know, inevitably, you're going to have a project funded from more than one source at one time, and that it might fund specific parts of that project as well. Yeah. You also have the ability to control when projects at the project level can approve things like budgets and commitments and invoices that a spreadsheet would never be able to do. You're just tracking it over here and there's this other team working on the project itself. You have no control over what they're doing or visibility into that, honestly. So with Kahua, you can do that all in one place where your project teams are working day to day on what they normally do with budgets and contracts and change management and all of that. But then you have the folks that have to track those fund sources and how they're being used on those projects, but it's all tied together with that transparency and visibility at the project level, because it's summarized all to the fund source level automatically. So your reporting becomes really just a click of the button at that point, rather than going through an arduous task of asking everyone, what is the budget? What's the contracts? What are the invoices on this project? And having to get that maybe from multiple systems or multiple people. But then as soon as you get it, it's out of date, right? Because another contract or a change order has been written and you have no visibility into that. So that's really what we've been able to iron out at Kahua through our fund source, sources of funds features within our tool.
Got it. Steve, this is a GovTech webinar, and obviously a lot of the focus is on government, but I can imagine that a lot of what we've talked about so far also applies to private projects. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's very common. Obviously, funding, as I was explaining before, is something that is it's foundational to the construction industry, and all of the different verticals have it in one way, shape, or form. I know that we have hospital clients, which you've got the examples of where people will only give funding for things like, I want to have a green garden put on top of the building and things like that. It's not uncommon. Most recently we've been working with Williams College, and Williams College it's a very straightforward funding, but something that most people are going to be familiar with. You've got funding comes in year over year. You've got to swap it out every year. It expires. Whatever you have to know what's been accrued, what's still outstanding. You got to pull some back. You got to bring the stuff in. Not much different than what you're seeing in the government space. The only difference is that it's private, but still basically the same mechanism. You're still tracking it. Somebody still has to report on it. As Amy was saying, is that at the end of the day, somebody wants to know there's a reason that they're providing funding in a way which is segregated. in the project, that they want to be able to come back and say, well, was it spent properly? And whether that's in private or in the government space, it's the same question. It's just who's asking the question.
Yeah, makes good sense. We've talked. This term "color of money" has come up a couple of different times now so far, and it's interesting because, as it turns out, that is in fact an official Department of Defense term, which speaks to the different types of appropriations and the ways that budget authority can be used or not used. And in some ways, that's a big part of what we've talked about here so far today, right? Is the money's not all the same shade of green. This has been, I think, really apparent when the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, was passed and has been, I think, a real point of focus for local governments all over, but particularly, I'm sure, some of our audience here today. Amy, there's been unprecedented amounts of money that have flown into, or have flowed, I should say, into state and local governments because of the IIJA. But just as we've been describing so far, this is coming with all sorts of new accountability requirements, different rules for tracking where money is spent, how. What sorts of challenges and opportunities, do you see surrounding that money in particular, given what we've talked about so far today?
Yeah, well, first of all, these funds will definitely have many rules required for tracking project expenditures. And these rules are sometimes not even determined until the project has been defined in some cases. So with this in mind, it's really important to not only have a system that can handle, first of all, the fund source management in general, but also that the system itself is flexible enough to conform to any rules that are put in place and that are required to utilize the funds. One thing, though, is its overall flexibility during implementation is not enough, though, because we must be able to react rapidly to any changes to the existing rules, because inevitably either those rules will change or there will be new rules that will be put in place, and maybe even midstream on a project, right? But many traditional SaaS products that have been used throughout the last few years can be flexible and accommodate rule changes, but in some cases you might need to wait a year or two for the development to be done to the software or invest millions of dollars to make that happen. So in the meantime, you're managing these projects and doing it on a system that can't really accommodate your needs. So in a world where the rules are changing so rapidly all the time, and as you mentioned, so much money is being kind of laid out there in this law, it's really it's crucial that the tools you use to track funding, they just really need to be able to adapt just as rapidly as the rules change. And with Kahua, organizations have control over how the system works, because it is a low-code, flexible platform. So potentially, you could make the system work differently on distinct types of projects and programs and fund sources. And as the rules change, you have the ability to change the rules as necessary on your own, if that's something that you desire to do. So,
yeah, Justin. One thing I was going to add on top of, in addition to what Amy was talking about, is that she mentioned a very key point. And this is where when you go down the journey of managing funding, you want to make sure that you do, if you haven't gotten a system yet, you want to make sure you get one that is fairly flexible when it comes to bringing funds in and out. And when COVID happened, and I mentioned this earlier, but that was extremely painful. We were able to make it happen, but it was not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination to be able to swap all those funds out, change the funding rules. A lot of manual work had to be done as a one-time exercise, but it is not an exercise that I would want to do twice. And so that's where you want to make sure that you're investing in a good system. And I know I got a buddy of mine that works with a very large train organization people may be familiar with, and they got about $40 billion worth of funding allocated to them, and they didn't really have a good system, and they were like scrambling. Okay, we got to get something put in place. So it's hard to believe that it's 2023, but you've got organizations out there which are not really that sophisticated. We joked about the ever-present Excel spreadsheet that nobody wanted to they don't want to give it up with their dying hands, because they know when it comes down to brass tacks, they can actually get the answers out when they have to. But as Amy alluded to, getting a good system in place has really been it's life changing for a lot of people, and from an organizational standpoint, it's something that really needs to happen.
Makes sense. When you think about the systems that are being put in place now, as we've been saying, in response to a bunch of different trends, but in particular the federal money and the rules that come with the federal money, can you envision any similar kinds of trends happening at, say, with state money, or any kind of additional, earmarked revenue sources, earmarked tax sources, that sort of thing? Is it possible that the federal government and its expectations are the catalyst, but that we see similar kinds of, color of money considerations for other types of money going forward? And could the systems that we're talking about here be helpful to that effect as well?
So I'll get started on it. Is that I recently spoke on a panel for ESG, and that's another area where people are providing funding, and they're bringing funding in at a state and city and municipal level for initiatives which are related to sustainability, energy, things like that. So it's not just the federal government that's providing this. A lot of the states and municipalities are also, they're receiving money too that they're then going out with as well. Or in Chicago, that you've got organizations that do nothing but distribute the funding from the government. So you've got different ways that the funding can show up. It doesn't always just show up with Uncle Sam knocking on your door and handing you a big bag of cash. It can be coming through different organizations. It can be coming through different channels. So, that's the kind of stuff that we've seen, and most recently when I've had conversations around it, where I've seen some examples like that.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point, particularly those regional organizations that are there to distribute the federal funding. Lots more rules and accountability and expectations certainly coming with interacting with them, and them having a lot more federal money to distribute as well. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah, and they're reporting, they're having to report, and then whoever's spending it has to report. So it's like, even if it gets channeled through another organization, everybody still has to do reporting, and that reporting has to bubble all the way up. And so you're never going to get away from that. And I don't care how many spreadsheets you put on your computer, it's never going to be enough. And it's never going to be, on Friday at 5 p.m. when somebody puts in that change order by accident, and then you have to recalculate everything, you'll be thanking yourself when you have a system that you can just rerun the report and it gives you the values, as opposed to having to do a mad scramble.
Definitely. Yeah. As much as our finance folks love their spreadsheets, I'm sure that could be a welcome change. Amy, anything to add to that? You looked like you were poised there a second ago to jump in.
I think when I talk about this with the folks that have to do this piece of the puzzle, right? They are usually the ones that are kind of off to the corner, and everybody else gets the fancy new toys, and they're still in their Excel spreadsheets, and their eyes just light up when we are able to show them that, yes, we've included you as part of this, as part of the solution, right? And there's no need for you to, kind of be over in the corner waiting for the information to be fed to you. As to Steve's point, there is always the 11th hour, and they're scrambling to put together a report that they've worked on for weeks, or just constantly, right? With having a solution that can just tie it all together is really, a game changer for these people.
Got it. So we're going to continue our conversation with the panelists here, but I'd encourage anyone in the audience, if you have questions that you want to put to our panelists, feel free to enter them in the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to them with the time that we have here at the end. We've been talking, Steve, about the challenges of reporting and accountability and transparency, and those are all certainly risks. If you don't do them well, you can find yourself on the receiving end of an audit or some other bigger challenge. There's other risks that we concern ourselves with in the construction business as well. Certainly, cost overruns, market fluctuations, delays and disbursements of government money. Are the systems that we're talking about here helpful in mitigating those risks as well?
So, when it comes to effectively, you're talking about external forces which are acting on a project, and really these sorts of systems, and like Kahua, as Amy's explaining, is it provides you with the ability to, in a centralized location, do forecasting, manage risk, take that information and aggregate it and provide a picture of where your project is at any given point in time. And really, that's the true value of these project management systems, is where you can very quickly collect information in. And if you're seeing, for instance, in wild fluctuations in the price of materials and things like we saw during again, COVID was a great time because so much insane things, I can remember prior to COVID, there was a huge spike in a lot of the commodity prices around steel. And one of the projects that I was working on here down in Miami was, the guys were they didn't want to lock in prices because they just felt like they couldn't do it. And so when you got a system where you can put in what you think it's going to be, and then you can track as the changes are coming in, then you can quickly redistribute or adjust your capital plan. And maybe you push a project out 6 months. Maybe you accelerate a project. These are the kind of things that, unless you have a system where you've got all your information in one place, how are you going to be able to effectively make decisions other than, kind of like shooting from the hip? My gut, I've done this for 20 years and I know this is kind of the trend. But a lot of the things that we've been seeing in the last 5 years, I would say, is almost unprecedented in the construction industry. And people are having to kind of make up the trail right then and there. And so these systems, it's a generic kind of an answer, but these systems provide you with insight so that you can tell sooner that you're on track or off track, and then you can adjust accordingly. But I wish they could. I wish there was a send me more money or make more time in my make me some more time in my schedule magic button on these systems. That hasn't been written yet. But what we do have is at least we've got a little bit of a view into the crystal ball to see what's coming down the pipeline.
Sure.
You guys haven't developed that button yet, have you, Amy? Not yet.
There's a couple buttons. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, got it. That would be an exciting product development, I would say.
Big seller, I would imagine. Yeah.
So let's go back to and revisit something we were talking a second ago, Steve. Just again, given the variety of folks here who are in the audience today, when we talk about those different funding sources for construction projects, we've been talking about projects kind of generically, but there's obviously huge variation in scale, right? Particularly I'm talking about anything involving governments. It could be something very, very small, a small elementary school, all the way up to, a massive bridge, a massive convention center, major public infrastructure projects.
Sure.
What are the main types of funds and that we're talking about here, and what kind of variation do you tend to see at different scales of projects?
The different types of it's kind of an open-ended question there, but what we see overwhelmingly, I think when you're looking at things like the IIJA, the federal government just has the ability to inject so much funding into these projects so quickly that, state organizations, they're not going to have that flexibility. And so we do see in a lot of the projects that we're working on, we do see a lot more federal funding than I would say than we do on, say, some of the state and some of the municipality. But it's it's really what's available and what's out there and what your organization is going for. You've got departments in these organizations that do nothing but look for the funding. It's back to the ESG that I was talking about earlier, is that decarbonization, perfect example, right? Decarbonization is out there. It's paid for by different sources, but you got to go out there and you've got to take your project and you've got to identify which projects are even available and which ones can be submitted for these different grants and these different funding types. And so, I was working on a project recently, and again, a lot of my examples are going to come back to New York City, just because it's such a big organization and so many different funding sources that they work with. But what they're having to do with their projects, and as part of their capital planning, is they're tracking, as part of this, as part of their capital planning exercise, which projects they feel like are going to be potentially eligible for these types of funding. And so what that ends up allows you, again, is you've got a system where you've got knowledge of what's in the pipeline. And then when an opportunity comes up and that opportunity requires this, that, or the other type of funding, you can very quickly ascertain which projects you can submit for this. And I'd say that is, as far as what funding is out there, I don't know if it's really necessary to answer which types of funding are out there, more to be prepared for the funding types when they present themselves. IIJA came down the pipe and, you had so many organizations scrambling, okay, wait a second, we want a piece of this. We want to be able to spend this money on something. And you've got to be able to quantify quite clearly what it is that you're going to, why you need the money, what you're going to be spending it on. Later on, you're going to be audited on this, obviously. And so you're going to need a good system that keeps track of what it is you actually spent the money on. But if you don't have a forward-looking view, if you don't have a vision in your project lifecycle, starting at the very beginning about what is out there and how you can submit projects for different funding types, you're going to be missing out. And I don't know if that was an exact answer to your question, Justin, but it was an answer. And
yeah.
And it's kind of the way that I see is like anything, be ready.
For sure. No, it's a great answer. Great answer. Amy, not to put you on the spot, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I guess there are certain organizations, for example, like K through 12 schools, that they are like for all of history. Bond issues come and they have to track those bonds and move money around constantly. So it's not just something new with like the new federal government funding. There's organizations that have to do this all the time, where it's someone's job to do this, or the job won't get done. The projects won't get built because they won't have the funding distributed, as well as during their audits, they won't have a way of reporting and have to kind of report out on that. Also, organizations that have potentially private funding or donation funds, that things have been specifically earmarked for certain things that they have to report back to whatever that foundation source is. It's not just federal funds. There are lots of different flavors of funding that could go into projects, both government projects as well as private. So it's all across the board.
Right. That makes good sense. Question, for both of you, if you wouldn't mind chiming in if you have a thought on it. So Steve's mentioned ESG a couple different times, right? Which, for anyone unfamiliar, that's environmental, social, and governance investment principles, which has been a huge point of emphasis in state and local government, finance, technology, procurement, you name it, over the last, it seems like really exploded the last maybe 3 years or so.
Yeah.
An important part of ESG, of course, is trying to connect funding to outcomes. A lot more emphasis on measuring impact. Are we in fact alleviating poverty? Are we creating more affordable housing? Are we reducing our carbon footprint? All of those, sorts of outcome indicators. When you think about the kinds of tools that we're talking about today, managing multiple funding sources is a huge challenge in and of itself. But are there opportunities here also to think about managing different funding sources and having some connection to those outcomes that are so important to the ESG world?
Okay, I missed the question was real quick again.
Yeah, are there when we think sorry if it wasn't clear, so much emphasis in ESG on outcomes.
Yes. Okay.
We're talking here today about managing multiple funding sources, which again is a big challenge in and of itself.
Yeah.
But in doing a better job of that, does that also then create opportunities to tell maybe a more compelling story about the outcomes or output side of things that is such an important point of emphasis these days?
So what I can think about right off the top of my head with that is that, if you're trying to tell a story and you want to tell the story of how you're compliant to ESG, ESG is just another type of regulation, policy, requirement, monitoring, call it what you will. But if you don't have a very clear funding allocation, and if you can't report clearly on that funding, and you can't answer the questions very quickly as to why that funding is appropriate for ESG, you're going to be challenged on it. And the systems, when they're set up properly and the funding is applied to them properly and the funding flows through, and at the end, somebody ultimately says, well, you were supposed to work on these 3 initiatives that were all part of your ESG goals for 2023. Well, prove it. And so ultimately, that's where the more information, the more data that you have in the system, the cleaner the reporting is on the way out of the system. Now, part of this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with, you got to really, really, really make sure that you're setting your system up properly. And that's where you got to really look at what your rules are. Amy alluded to this a couple of times. There's going to be rules. IIJ is going to come down the pipeline. There's going to be rules. And then they're going to modify the rules. And the cleaner you've got your data structured on the front end, when you see modifications and changes coming down the pipeline, it'll be easier to quickly adjust tact and then move and be able to make sure that you're still compliant. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're meeting your regulations, your policy requirements, or it could just be as simple as maybe it's just your internal goals. I mean, there are organizations that, not everything is because somebody's going to go to jail if this doesn't happen. I mean, that's a very good driver of change. However, sometimes it's just because people, within their organizations want to do something different. With ESG is, company goals where people they want to do some things that they feel would be better for the environment, but they're not going to be able to meet those goals if they're not tracking those goals. And that's ultimately going to be tied back to, really the funding that is being fed into the organization and tracked through the contract vehicles and the whole way through. But it all boils down to what's your PMIS system and how's it set up, and did you set it up in a way that you can report out? Amy, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take all the time.
No, just to summarize everything you said is exactly what I was going to say around just start with the end in mind, right? When you're building your process, and then put a technology in place that can help you get there, right? So always, whatever your goals are, determine what they are at first, and then kind of work backwards and make it work. And also have the ability to change, because your goal line might change because of some rules that have changed, right? So have the ability to be flexible on that, but you don't want to put something in place that doesn't get you there, that you have to do something else outside of that process to get there, right?
Absolutely. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions for our panelists, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. We're going to get to those in just a second, so be sure to jump in here while we still have some time. I'm going to go to another poll question here in just a second, but before we do that, anything else as part of our panel discussion here that anybody else wants to make sure we get in before we move on? Anything that came up that you want to expand on? Anything I didn't ask? Anything, questions that we haven't gotten to that you think are really essential before we jump into the rest?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd like to do is summarize not summarize, add on to what Amy said is that, there was an example I can remember back in 2011, we were standing up a system for Texas A&M University system. And they were adamant that they had to track their funding this certain way. And we warned them, we're like, this is really not a good way. This is going to be maximum pain. And they were like, nope, this is the way we're going to do it. And sure enough, we built the system because they would not budge. And 2 years later, they came back and internally they were like, why the hell are we doing it this way? My apologies. This makes no sense. But somebody had to basically probably, burn through like 3, admins that just quit because they refused to do the work anymore. And when we're talking about setting up these systems and setting up how you manage funding and things like that, do keep that in mind, is that it's just as easy as it is to make it more efficient. You can make somebody's life miserable really fast. If you take something that's bad and accelerate it 1,000 times, it's just going to get that much worse. So I would say that, begin with the end in mind, like Amy was talking about, and really focus on that, focus on what you're really trying to get out, what you really need to achieve, and then start doing your development.
Makes good sense. All right. Well, thank you for a terrific panel discussion. I'm going to go to a couple quick poll questions, and then we will get to your questions from the audience. So, poll question number 3 for the day. What are you using for cost management? What are you using for cost management? We have 5 choices: internal custom design software, manual processes or general use software like Excel, off-the-shelf software specifically to manage cost management, full project lifecycle, project management information system, PMIS, or we use 2 or more of the above solutions. We've talked a lot about many of these systems here in our conversation today, so definitely curious to hear what our audience has been using, given that it sounds like there's advantages and disadvantages to each of them, but absolutely some trends moving toward or away from different systems that we've talked about already so far here today. So let's see what we have. Manual processes or general use software. Go back to Steve's point about Excel a little bit earlier.
Favorite. It's always going to be in the top. It's always going to be in the top 3. Never miss it. Never miss it.
That's right. And with as many finance folks as we have on the webinar, I suspect that that's part of that. Nothing wrong with that, but just a reflection of what people are using. Internal custom design software, a few. Off-the-shelf software, a couple. And then maybe not surprisingly, using 2 or more of the above solutions. Interesting data from our participants. All right, and then one last poll question for you today. Would you like to be contacted for additional information? Yes, I'd like a demo. Yes, I'd like to speak to a rep. Yes, I'd like to receive additional resources, or no, I'm not interested today. So demo request, would like to speak to a rep, additional resources, or not interested today. It's funny you mentioned, Steve, the painful implementations on some of these systems, and I am curious to hear if there's any audience Q&A. Lots of folks working particularly at that finance IT intersection in state and local governments. Many have been involved, I'm sure, in exactly those kinds of implementations that sometimes work well and sometimes work less well. So it'll be interesting to see what anyone has to say about that. All right, and then so we do have some interest in that. So thank you all for your feedback. All right, well, let's get to some questions then. We have an audience question here that I think is sort of touches on some things we've talked about, but it is also a little bit different. It says, how do you prioritize beyond the amount of funding? So getting beyond just the amount of funding, how do you prioritize which stream of funding will drive a project? We have drive in quotes. Which stream of funding will drive the project and beyond sponsorship? So it's an interesting question to think about, which funding streams seem to be the ones that, are going to get the most attention or are going to have the most influence on the way you think about managing the project. Amy or Steve, whoever has an answer to that, maybe go ahead and jump in.
Well, I can talk about a funny example for this is that, there's no shortage of people in New York that are without opinion or noisy and boisterous if they don't get what they want. And of all the different types of funding sources that we have in New York City, it's funny that the one that a lot of times ends up getting the most attention is the small funding allocations that come in from the commissioners. They've got a small group of people that they're sitting in town hall meetings with, and they are like, we gave you, $750,000 last year. That part of that money got applied to a, it might be like a $700,000, $700 million project, and that, believe it or not, ends up being some of the money that you have to track and keep tabs of. Now, the federal dollars, a lot of times, the dollars are so great, or in situation where you maybe have a monitoring situation in place, obviously that takes precedent. But sometimes it's just the squeaky wheel. Who's the squeaky wheel stakeholder? When it comes down to outside of regulation, is it, who's the one that's going to cause the most problems for you? So I know that's been we've had to put a lot of things in place to manage that, to keep track of that, so that we could report out on it quickly. But that as small as the funding is, they seem to get a disproportionately large amount of the attention.
Yeah, for sure. And when it's people who literally live in your neighborhood, that takes on a whole new weight. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Amy, anything to add to that? Again, not to put you on the spot, but.
Yeah, so I think it's more than just about funding as well. It's as organizations are prioritizing projects in general and doing their capital planning and all of that, it's what will make the most impact to the organization, and then which of those do we have funding for at that point, and then being able to just see into the future sometimes as well, knowing potentially what funding will come in, but then having to constantly reanalyze what that future looks like. And then, as Steve has mentioned many times during this webinar, there's something that COVID that hits, and having to then put the brakes on and go, wait a minute, our plans are all out the window. How can we quickly, not just funding wise, but like with also the shortages in construction labor and all of that, like it all fits into the same puzzle. And even the projects that we want to do and that we have funding for, we might not even be able to do because of that. And they might get delayed and move into the next year. And then it affects other, it's just a domino effect. So making sure that, again, you have systems that allow you to do that quickly. Like, of course, you can still do that in Excel, but you need to be able to react quickly on all fronts to make it right in the end, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the critical decision points is that, when's that money going to expire? It's like if you've got a project for $1 million, but you're not going to be spending most of the money until next year, and you've got money that's going to expire this year, that project, may get to be a lower priority. And really, these are this is the state of the organization and the state of how the money comes and goes. It ultimately comes down to, it's kind of like a cash flow exercise almost, where it's you can't be paying vendors when there's no money to pay. And if you know that you've got future funding that's coming in, well, we're going to structure projects differently. So whatever your organization, I'm not sure who asked the question, but whatever your organization looks like from how the money comes in and how the money flows in, that's really going to be probably the key driver. That's what I would say.
Definitely, definitely. Amy, to go back just for a second to something you had mentioned a little bit ago, we think about envisioning and re-envisioning the future. What if we could be maybe even a little bit more specific on that? When you think about tools available for scenario analysis and planning, we've been talking about it kind of in general, but when you think about particular tools available to that end, what comes to mind?
Well, I mean, Kahua can do it all for you. So we do have capital planning tools within our system that can kind of do that cash flow forecasting for entire programs, where you can have multiple versions of that capital plan, run them through approval workflows, things like that. And then when a capital plan is approved, then push them into the actual operation stage. So it all ties together again, as well as with the fund source management as well. So, it's an all-inclusive sort of planning tool, as well as a project management tool during the course of running the projects.
Yeah, and one of the things that's nice about Kahua is it does give you the opportunity to integrate things, because we work with organizations that it's not Kahua and the integrations are painful, but they're necessary. Because if you've got a system of record that finance is using, they're going to be putting their money in that system. They're not going to put it in your PMIS system. They're just not going to. It doesn't happen. And so you need to be able to get that information over quickly, and then that way you can slice and dice it. You can put wherever it needs to, and then you can push back when invoices come and things like that. So again, begin with the end in mind. With what are you trying to achieve? Where's the system of record for this? Get that information, you're entering it one time. A system like Kahua is going to be able to make you do that more efficiently.
Yep.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask our panelists one last question here before we wrap up. I'll start with Steve, and then we can give Amy the last word.
Sure.
If you could leave our audience with, what is your one big takeaway from today's conversation? What is that one big takeaway, Steve?
I think the one big takeaway that I would have is that, make sure you think about what it is you're trying to achieve. Think about the end, understand the rules, and then decide how you're going to develop your business process. And business process is flexible. You can adjust it. Might not be the easiest conversation to have, and you may not really want to call that department, but think about what your requirements are, simplify it, streamline it, have the conversation as an organization, make it as efficient as possible, and then bring in some automation and make it, to get you the reporting need.
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, and I guess my one takeaway would be, don't try to overcomplicate it as well. And try as best as you can to have the information in one place, so that you're not building silos of information that require sort of manual communication as well. So don't overcomplicate it, and try to find that tool that can help you do it all, or do most of it in one place to take that pain away.
Terrific. Well, I want to be respectful of our time commitment here today, so we'll have to wrap it up there. In closing, thanks again to Amy and Stephen for sharing all of your insights on today's webcast. I really appreciate an excellent conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience did as well. I want to also thank Kahua for making it possible to have this important webcast discussion today.